Welcome back to History and Haven. There is a village green in Massachusetts, and it is spring, and it is cold, and the year is 1775. A few hundred farmers stand on the wet grass in the last of the dark, holding muskets they do not truly know how to aim, tools kept above a doorframe for crows and wolves, not for men who march in ordered ranks. Somewhere down the road, coming steadily closer, is an army that has crossed an entire ocean for the single purpose of keeping these farmers obedient. Nearly every man on that green expects to be home before his breakfast goes cold. Not one of them can feel the size of the thing they stand at the edge of. A war so slow in its beginning that it will hardly announce itself. And out of that war, a new kind of country, arranged not around the person of a king, but around an argument about who may govern whom, by what right, and with whose permission. Tonight we follow that argument from the first faint smell of smoke to the hour it becomes a fire no one can put out. Before any of that, take a slow moment for yourself. If these long walks through the past give you some quiet company, you might gently tap like or subscribe, but only if you truly want to. And if you feel like sharing, leave your corner of the world and your local time in the comments. It helps the other night owls and sleepless travellers find their way to this little room. And know that someone else is awake out there too. Now let your shoulders come down. Let the day slide off behind you, unfinished. And let yourself drift into the long story of the American Revolution. To understand how it began, we have to turn from the gunfire and look at the world as it actually was, because nothing here was written in advance. In the 1760s, the people living along the eastern rim of North America did not think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as British, and they meant it. They drank British tea, read British newspapers weeks after the news inside them had gone stale, wore coats cut to a London pattern, and prayed in churches whose shapes had crossed the water with their grandparents. When they spoke of home, many still meant England, a place most of them had never seen and never would. They were proud of being British, and that pride is the piece most easily forgotten now, though it explains everything that follows. They believed themselves holders of the rights of free Englishmen, rights pried loose slowly and painfully across centuries of argument between English kings and English subjects. Chief among them was an idea worn so smooth it had hardened into something close to sacred. A free man could not be taxed without the consent of the men he had chosen to speak for him. In England, those men sat in Parliament. In the colonies, they sat in local assemblies. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, first gathered in 1619, and the oldest elected body in English America, and in the Massachusetts General Court. Colonial money was colonial business, and London was content to leave it so. Things that work are rarely examined. There was a comfortable distance built into the whole system, and it was not only emotional. It was measured in salt water. A letter leaving London might take 6 weeks to reach Boston, or 8 if the winds were generous and the ship did not go down. An instruction from the king's ministers could be a full season old by the time a governor broke its seal, its urgency long gone soft. That lag quietly handed the colonies the management of their own affairs, not out of principle, but out of necessity. When a decision must be made today and the nearest authority is 2 months away by sail, people learn to decide for themselves. Decade after decade, that habit thickened into a kind of independence nobody had declared and almost nobody had noticed. And the colonies were not one place. They were 13 separate worlds, each with its own weather, its own economy, its own quiet certainty that it was the most sensible of the lot. A Boston merchant and a South Carolina planter held about as much in common as a Scotsman and a Spaniard, which is to say they shared a language, a king, and a deep suspicion of one another's manners. They quarrelled over boundaries, trade, religion, and unpaid debts. That these 13 bickering neighbours might one day stand together as one nation would have struck almost anyone alive in 1760 as fantasy, and a faintly comic one. And yet something was moving underneath, the way a riverbank hollows out long before it falls. The population was climbing at a rate that astonished visiting Europeans. Benjamin Franklin sat down with the figures in 1751 and found it doubling roughly every 20 to 25 years, a small, dry pamphlet that would later reach Thomas Malthus and unsettle him considerably. Families were large, land was cheap by the standards of a crowded continent, and people lived a little longer and ate a little better than their cousins overseas. A young man here could expect to hold ground of his own, and a man who owns ground develops firm opinions about whose hand may reach into his pocket. This was a society of small property holders, restless and ambitious, and quiet confidence does not stay quiet forever. The land shaped them too. To the west stood the dark wall of the mountains, and past it, a frontier with no visible far edge, forest and river, offering fortune to the bold and disaster to the careless. The colonists pressed against that boundary without pause, hungry for new acres, and that hunger was moving toward two collisions at once, with the native nations already living on that ground, and with a distant government forming opinions about where settlement ought to stop. Pride, distance, growth, land hunger. Not one alone would have broken an empire. Stacked together, year upon year, they were laying the kindling. Historians still turn the question over, whether a wiser ministry in London could have held it all together with a few small courtesies, or whether the split was already written into the arithmetic of population and ocean, and could only have been postponed. And so we come back to that cold green, and the men waiting there in the dark. They were not rebels yet. Most still hoped the trouble would drift past, that London would come to its senses, that the comfortable old arrangement would hold. They were ordinary people standing on a threshold, and like most people on most thresholds, they had no notion of what waited on the other side. To understand why they stood there at all, we have to go back further still, into that vanished world as it lived and breathed before any shot was fired, before the word independence had crossed more than a few lips. We will walk through it gently and see the whole of it. Picture the eastern seaboard in the middle of the 1760s, a long, thin ribbon of settlement pressed against the Atlantic, held between the water on one side and that dark ridge of the Appalachians on the other. Beyond those mountains lay a continent Europeans had scarcely begun to imagine. In front of them lay the sea, and the sea was everything. These were a coastal people, their lives arranged around harbours and river mouths, their faces turned outward. Trade came by ship, news came by ship, fashion, authority, orders from ministers, all of it arrived on the tide. And a town's importance could be measured by the forest of masts standing in its harbour. In the north sat New England, 4 colonies with a flavour all their own. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island and New Hampshire had been settled largely by Puritans, and generations later, the fingerprints of that founding were still on everything. New Englanders cared about education to a degree that puzzled outsiders. They built schools early, and a college earlier still, Harvard raised in 1636, when the settlements were barely more than clearings. Massachusetts had even passed a law requiring towns of 50 families to hire someone to teach the children to read, on the reasoning that ignorance was how the devil got in. They argued theology the way other people argue about the weather, and they governed themselves in town meetings, where an ordinary man could stand up and be heard. It was a country of small farms, fishing fleets, shipyards and merchants. The soil was stony, the winters long, and perhaps that explains the reputation its people earned for thrift, stubbornness, and a certain gift for moral certainty. Boston was their great city, though by London's measure it was hardly a town at all, some 15,000 souls. Still, Boston hummed. Its wharves bristled, its taverns talked late, and its merchants had grown rich moving goods around the Atlantic, sometimes inside the letter of British trade law, and sometimes with a friendly wink just past it. Smuggling in Boston was very nearly a respectable trade. Hold on to that, because when London eventually decided to enforce its trade laws in earnest, it was not disturbing an abstract principle. It was reaching into the strongboxes of some extremely determined men. South of New England, the picture shifted. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware were a patchwork rather than a pattern, far more mixed than tidy New England ever was. Dutch families whose grandparents had known the place as New Amsterdam. German farmers laying out the Pennsylvania countryside. Scots-Irish pushing hard toward the frontier. Quakers, Catholics, Jews, and a dozen other communities who had come looking for land, or refuge, or simply the peace of being left alone. Philadelphia stood at the center of it, the largest and most polished city in British America. Broad streets, brick fronts, printers and scientists, and restless commerce. It was the most modern place on the continent, and before long, it would become the room in which 13 quarrelsome colonies first learned to speak with a single voice. Further south again, another world entirely. Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, warm air and long growing seasons, great plantations unrolling along the riverbanks. The economy there rested on cash crops, tobacco above all, with rice and indigo as one moved down the coast, and it rested, brutally, on enslaved labour. Slavery existed in all 13 colonies without exception, but in the South it had become the floor the entire order stood on. The wealth of the great planter families, the Washingtons, the Lees, the Randolphs of Virginia, was drawn out of the forced labour of human beings they claimed to own. That is the deep and bitter contradiction lying at the centre of this story, and we will not step around it. The same men who were about to write some of the most stirring sentences ever set down about liberty and the rights of all people were, many of them, holding other people in bondage as the ink dried. It belongs to the truth of the thing, and the truth is what we came for. Across all three regions, ordinary life had a texture at once familiar and strange. The great majority of colonists lived on farms and worked the ground. Their hours were ruled by sunlight and season, by sowing and harvest, by the endless business of pulling a family's food out of the soil. Most never travelled more than a few dozen miles from the place they were born. Their world was a village, a county, a parish, and word of the wider one came slowly, carried by travellers, by peddlers on the road, and by the thin, precious sheets of the colonial newspapers. Those newspapers matter more than they appear to. The colonies held an unusually literate population for the age, New England most of all, and printed words travelled where people could not. A pamphlet set in type in Boston could be reprinted in Philadelphia and read aloud in a Charleston tavern within a few weeks. Ideas moved. And the men who owned the presses, the printers and editors and pamphleteers, would prove sharper weapons in the long run than any musket. Historians still argue about how much of the coming rebellion was made in those printing shops rather than on the battlefields, and it is not a settled question. Holding this loose, mismatched world together was the frame of British rule. Every colony had a governor, generally appointed by the king, and every colony had an elected assembly of local property holders. The governors held the formal authority, the assemblies held the money. Over the decades, the assemblies had learned exactly what that leverage was worth, and used it to squeeze out concessions, much as Parliament had once squeezed English monarchs. The whole arrangement ran on friction, but the friction was familiar, and familiar friction has its own rough stability. Almost nobody wanted it overturned. That is the point most easily missed. The colonists were not shopping for a revolution. If anything, they wanted only to go on managing their own affairs undisturbed, as they had quietly been doing for a century. The trouble, when it came, would not arrive because the colonies demanded something new. It would arrive because London decided to take something away. And to understand why London decided that, we have to go back to a war that was already finished by the time this story properly begins. A war fought on colonial soil, though not in the colony's name. A war that had emptied the British treasury down to the boards. For most of the 1750s and on into the early years of the next decade, the colonies were swept up in a conflict much larger than themselves. In North America, they called it the French and Indian War. In Europe, where it spilled across continents and oceans, it formed part of what later historians named the 7 Years' War, a struggle so wide in its reach that some have called it the first true World War. Underneath all of it lay a single contest, Britain against France, for trade and territory and influence everywhere on the map. And one of the prizes on that map was the interior of North America. The trouble started in wild country, in the Ohio Valley, that contested ground past the mountains where colonial ambition ran straight into French claim. Both empires wanted it. So did the native nations who actually lived on it, and who played the two powers off one another with considerable skill for as long as the game could be played. Into that wilderness rode a young Virginia officer, barely into his 20s, named George Washington. He had been sent on an errand that helped ignite the whole war, and his first efforts there ended in muddle, defeat, and surrender. He gave up a waterlogged little stockade in a meadow, and the terms he signed were written in French, a language he could not read, so that he confessed to an assassination without knowing he had done it. The date of that surrender was the 4th of July, 1754, which the world would not find ironic for another 22 years. Keep the young man in mind. The officer who fumbled his first command in the Ohio woods would one day be asked to win a nation its independence, and he carried those early humiliations with him for the rest of his life. The war went badly for Britain at first. French troops and their native allies handed sharp defeats to British and colonial armies alike, and there were seasons when the whole cause looked hopeless. But Britain had deeper pockets and a far stronger navy, and under determined leadership in London, the current gradually reversed. In 1759, British forces took the great fortress city of Quebec in a battle fought on the heights above the St. Lawrence, a fight so brief and so ruinous that both commanding generals died of their wounds within a day of each other. After Quebec, the French grip on the continent came apart in the hands. By the formal end of the war in 1763, France had been pushed almost entirely off North America. Britain now held an empire there of astonishing size, running from the frozen north down through the 13 colonies and westward as far as the Mississippi. It was an enormous victory, and the colonists claimed it as theirs. They had marched in that war and bled in it beside British regulars. They were proud subjects of a triumphant empire, and in the warm light of 1763, the bond between the colonies and the mother country had perhaps never felt stronger. Stand in a Boston street or a Philadelphia coffeehouse that year and predict that within a dozen summers these same men would be firing on British soldiers, and you would have been laughed out into the road. But the victory came with a bill, and the bill was money. Wars are ruinously expensive, and this one had been more expensive than most. Britain finished it triumphant and very nearly broke, its national debt swollen to a figure that alarmed its ministers and frightened its taxpayers. The people at home were already among the most heavily taxed in Europe, and they had no appetite whatever for paying more. And so, in London, the ministers made a calculation that looked entirely reasonable from where they were sitting, and which turned out to be one of the costliest miscalculations any empire has ever made. The war, they reasoned, had been fought largely to defend the American colonies and to win them new ground. The colonists had gained handsomely. Surely, then, it was only fair that the colonists help pay for it. And on top of the old debt, there was now a vast new territory to garrison, which meant a standing army kept in North America, which meant fresh expense every year without end. The logic ran in a straight, confident line. The colonies should contribute to their own defense. The simplest way to make them contribute was to tax them, and therefore they would be taxed. The flaw in that tidy reasoning was not the arithmetic. The flaw was that the men doing the reasoning knew almost nothing about the people they were reasoning about. They pictured grateful provincials who would shoulder a fair share without much complaint. They did not grasp how firmly the colonists held that old principle about consent, nor understand that to a New England farmer or a Virginia planter, a tax laid down by a parliament containing no one he had chosen was not a fair share of anything. It was an assault on the first right of a free Englishman. It tells you how little time those gentlemen had ever spent in an American tavern, where such principles were argued over with the heat and certainty that other men reserve for religion. Then there was the question of the Western land, and here London gave offence almost at once. To keep the peace with the native nations of the interior, and to avoid paying for endless frontier wars, the government issued a proclamation in 1763 forbidding colonial settlement beyond the crest of the Appalachians. From a desk in London it was prudence. From a farmhouse in Virginia it was an outrage. The very wilderness they had helped win with their own blood was now closed to them by an authority that had never walked a yard of it. Speculators who had sunk fortunes into Western tracts, Washington himself among them, watched their plans cancelled by a stroke of the royal pen. Historians still debate whether that line on the map was ever enforceable at all, or whether it was simply a promise London had no means to keep, which may be the worst kind of promise to make. So the years that should have been a golden age of imperial goodwill became instead the season in which the first resentments were planted. The colonists believed their loyalty had earned them respect, and perhaps reward. What arrived instead was new taxation and new restriction, designed by men who did not know them and had not asked them. The mood began, very quietly, to spoil. It was not yet anger. It was something slower and more dangerous than anger. The dawning sense of being handled as subordinates rather than partners, as something a little less than Englishmen. And into that souring mood, in the year 1765, London introduced the one measure that would turn a quiet grievance into open defiance. It was called the Stamp Act, and on the page it looked nearly harmless. From 1765, Parliament decreed a long list of printed things in the colonies would have to be made on special stamped paper. Paper already taxed and marked with an official seal to prove the duty had been paid. Newspapers, legal documents, contracts and licenses, even playing cards and dice. The sums involved were trifling, a few pennies here and there, and the money was meant to help keep the soldiers stationed in America. The ministers who drew it up expected grumbling. What they received was an explosion. The Act found a nerve nobody in London had known was there, and it found the same nerve in every colony at once. Until then, Parliament had taxed trade, and the colonists had accepted that grudgingly as the traditional business of empire. This was different. This reached inside, into the documents and newspapers and ordinary transactions of daily life, and it had been laid on them by a body containing no representative of theirs, no voice, no vote. They reached back for that old, worn principle and sharpened it into a slogan that would outlive everyone who shouted it. No taxation without representation. Even Benjamin Franklin, sitting in London and closer to the ministry than most, misread the moment badly enough to recommend a friend for the post of stamp distributor, and spent the following year explaining himself to furious countrymen. The response came fast, and it came cleverly. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions denouncing the act and restating their rights. In Virginia, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry rose in the House of Burgesses and spoke with such heat that older members around him were heard muttering the word treason. But the real resistance did not stay inside the panelled chambers. It went out into the streets. In Boston and in other towns, a network of organized opposition appeared, calling itself the Sons of Liberty. These were not gentlemen in powdered wigs. They were merchants and artisans, printers and tavern keepers, and men who worked the docks, the middling and labouring sort, and they understood something the ministry in London never managed to learn, which was the power of a crowd, a spectacle, and a well-aimed threat. When the men appointed to hand out the stamped paper arrived at their new posts, the Sons of Liberty made their lives unlivable. Effigies swung from tree branches. Distributors were paraded through the streets to the sound of drums, and sometimes their houses were pulled apart around them. One after another, often publicly and in writing, the stamp distributors resigned, until there was scarcely a man left in America willing to enforce the law. And a tax that cannot be collected is not a tax at all. It is only an insult printed on paper. To the pressure in the streets, the colonists added pressure of a colder kind. Merchants along the whole coast agreed to stop importing British goods until the Act was gone. Those non-importation agreements went straight for British manufacturers and traders, who woke to find their American market simply evaporating. And here the colonists found a weapon they would reach for again and again. They could not vote in Parliament, but they could decline to buy. And in declining to buy, they could register their anger in the one place London genuinely felt things, which was the ledger. There was also a meeting that autumn, which mattered far more than it seemed to at the time. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies came together in New York for what history calls the Stamp Act Congress. It was the first occasion on which representatives from a broad spread of colonies had sat down to coordinate an answer to a shared grievance. They were nervous about it, careful to profess their loyalty to the king in the warmest terms, and in formal accomplishment they achieved very little. But the precedent had been laid. 13 separate worlds had taken one small step toward becoming something that could speak with a single voice. Nobody in that room was planning a revolution. They were trying to get a tax repealed. They were also building a habit of cooperation, and habits, once they set, are difficult to break. The pressure worked. The boycotts bit deep. British merchants howled, and in 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. The colonies burst into celebration, bonfires and toasts and grateful addresses to the king. For one bright moment, it appeared the storm had blown over, the comfortable old order restored, loyalty and reason victorious. Historians still weigh which force actually did the work, the colonial boycott or the lobbying of British merchants who had lost their customers. And the honest answer is probably that neither would have been enough without the other. But the celebration rested on a misunderstanding. Tucked in beside the repeal, Parliament had quietly passed a second law, the Declaratory Act, stating in cold and absolute language that Parliament held the right to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. London had given up the tax. It had not given up an inch of the principle. The real disagreement lay exactly where it had been, unresolved, waiting. It did not wait long. Within a year, a new chancellor in London, a clever and careless man named Charles Townshend, devised a fresh scheme for drawing revenue out of America. The Townshend duties placed taxes on goods coming into the colonies, on glass and paper and paint, on lead and on tea. Townshend believed he had found a path around the objection, since these were duties on trade, the sort of thing colonists had always tolerated, rather than an internal tax like the stamp. He was wrong. The colonists had walked straight past such fine distinctions. Any tax designed to take revenue from them without their consent was a tax they would resist, whatever elegant name was hung on it. So the whole cycle turned again, harder this time, with less goodwill left in the machinery. New non-importation agreements spread along the coast. The Sons of Liberty grew better organized and more confident. Colonial writers poured out pamphlets and essays, arguing the case with sharper logic and steadily less deference. And London, its patience wearing through, reading all of this as ingratitude and lawlessness, made a decision it would come to regret. It would send soldiers to Boston, the most defiant town in America, to restore order and to stand visibly behind the authority of the crown. Redcoats began marching through streets that did not want them, lodging among people who resented their presence, their muskets, and the plain sight of them at the end of a lane. It was a recipe with only one possible result, and the result was not slow in arriving. By the winter of 1770, Boston had become an unhappy, tightly wound town. Soldiers had been quartered there for more than a year, and the friction between them and the townspeople had worn rougher with every month. To the people of Boston, they were an occupying force, sent to frighten free men in their own streets. To the soldiers, Boston was a miserable posting, full of sullen civilians who insulted them, mocked them, and now and then threw whatever lay nearest to hand. Underneath the high principle ran something smaller and more human, a detail often lost beneath the grand story. British soldiers were badly paid, and many of them took part-time work in the town during their off hours to make the money stretch, which meant they stood in line for the same scarce jobs as local labourers, and were often willing to take less. So the working men of Boston had an ordinary reason to hate the redcoats, quite apart from any argument about liberty. The soldiers were taking bread off their tables. Revolutions are built from great ideas, certainly, but they are also built from grievances this small, and it is usually the small ones that strike the match. On the evening of the 5th of March, 1770, the small grievance and the great one met on the same patch of ground. It began, as these things do, with almost nothing. A young apprentice traded angry words with a sentry standing guard outside the custom house on King Street. The words got worse. The sentry struck the youth, and people began to gather in the cold and the snow. The crowd grew, and as it grew, it hardened. They shouted at the lone soldier, threw snowballs and chunks of ice, pressed nearer. Frightened, he called for help, and a small squad came to him under an officer, so that now there were several redcoats with their backs against the custom house wall, facing a swelling, jeering mass in the dark. It was as dangerous as a moment can be. The soldiers were outnumbered and afraid. The crowd was furious and growing bold. Voices dared them to fire. Objects came out of the dark. The front of the mob surged and fell back and surged again. The officer tried to hold his men steady, and then, in all that shouting, one musket went off. Others followed. The flashes lit the street, and when the smoke thinned, there were Bostonians down in the reddened snow. 5 colonists died of the wounds taken that night. Among the first to fall was a dock worker of African and Native American descent named Crispus Attucks, remembered ever since as one of the earliest to die in the cause of American liberty. They were ordinary men, all of them, and their deaths turned a political argument into something you could feel in the stomach. Blood had been spilled. British soldiers had killed British subjects in an American street. Historians still debate whether any order to fire was ever given at all, or whether the volley simply happened, the way a panic happens. The event needed a name, and the patriot leaders of Boston chose one designed to burn: the Boston Massacre. Here we meet the real genius of the colonial resistance, which understood early that the fight was not only in the streets, but in the mind, and that how a thing is remembered can matter more than what actually occurred. A silversmith and engraver named Paul Revere produced a vivid print of the scene, a neat rank of British soldiers firing in cold deliberation into a helpless knot of townspeople. As reporting it was thoroughly misleading. The truth of that night had been a confused and terrifying scramble, not an orderly execution. As propaganda, it was magnificent. Revere had also lifted the composition almost entirely from a fellow Boston engraver named Henry Pelham, who complained bitterly and was ignored, since the image was already travelling. It moved through the colonies and burned itself into the public mind, and the massacre became a symbol, the proof of everything the colonists had feared, that the government in London would kill them to have its way. And yet, In one of the most surprising turns in the whole story, the soldiers who fired were given a fair trial. The man who rose to defend them in court was John Adams, a Boston lawyer, a committed patriot, cousin to the fiery Samuel Adams, and a future leader of the Revolution himself. Adams believed that even hated men were owed a proper defense, and that the rule of law was the very thing the colonists claimed to be fighting for. To throw it aside the moment it became inconvenient would be to betray the cause in the act of defending it. So he defended them, argued they had fired in real fear for their lives, and won acquittals. It cost him popularity, and it took courage, and it revealed something about the better instincts inside the movement, an attachment to law and fairness that would, at its best, shape the country still to come. Then, strangely, the temperature dropped. By a coincidence almost too neat to believe, on the very day of the killings on King Street, Parliament in London had moved to repeal most of the Townshend duties, bending once again under the weight of colonial boycott. One duty was kept. The tax on tea stayed, not because it brought in much money, but because the government wanted to keep hold of the principle that it could tax the colonies at all. With the rest of the duties gone, much of the heat left the quarrel. Trade started up again. The boycotts loosened and faded. For 2 or 3 years an uneasy quiet lay over the colonies, and a great many people on both sides of the ocean allowed themselves to believe the worst was behind them. The quiet was a false one. Nothing underneath had been settled. The tea tax still stood, a small permanent reminder of a principle one side refused to accept and the other refused to surrender. The memory of the men who fell on King Street did not soften. The Sons of Liberty kept their networks warm, kept writing, kept watching the harbour. Beneath the calm, the two sides stood precisely as far apart as they had ever been, and a single new provocation would be enough to break the surface. In 1773, over that very tax on tea, the provocation came. The crisis that finally broke the calm grew out of something that ought to have made tea cheaper rather than more dangerous, which tells you how raw the nerves along that coast had become. It started with the British East India Company, an enormous trading corporation that had blundered its way into serious financial trouble. The company sat on mountains of unsold tea, and the government in London, whose interests were tangled up in the company's survival, devised a rescue. Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, permitting the East India Company to ship its tea straight to the colonies and sell it through chosen agents, with the middlemen cut out of the chain. The result was that company tea, even carrying that small surviving duty, would land cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea many colonists had been drinking for years. On the surface, it looked like a present to the American consumer. Cheaper tea. Who quarrels with cheaper tea? The colonial leaders saw the hook inside the bait, and the hook was real. Every purchase of that cheap taxed tea would be a small, silent admission that Parliament had the right to tax them. London had wrapped the hated principle inside a bargain and gambled that colonial thrift would defeat colonial conviction. It was a clever wager, badly aimed. There was a plainer anger underneath the philosophy too. The new arrangement threatened to ruin the colonial merchants who had built their houses on importing tea, and the smugglers besides, who were frequently the very same respectable gentlemen leading the resistance. Principle and self-interest were now pointing the same direction, which is the most combustible arrangement in all of politics. So it was decided, up and down the coast, that the East India Company's tea would not be sold. In most ports, the quiet pressure of the Sons of Liberty was enough. Ships were turned back before they moored. Cargoes were locked in damp warehouses and left to spoil. Consignees were visited, spoken to, and persuaded to refuse delivery. The tea simply could not be put ashore. Boston was the exception, and Boston became a collision. The royal governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was a proud and stubborn man who had decided the law would be obeyed and the tea would be landed. Several vessels loaded with company tea lay at anchor in the harbour, and the governor would not clear them to leave without first unloading and paying the duty. The Sons of Liberty were just as certain the tea would never touch a Boston dock. A legal deadline was closing in, after which the cargo could be seized and sold by the authorities regardless of anyone's feelings. Neither side would move. On the night of the 16th of December, 1773, the colonists broke the deadlock in a manner no one in London had thought to prepare for. A large body of men, some of them thinly disguised as Mohawk warriors with soot and paint smeared across their faces, gathered near the water, walked out along the wharf, and boarded the tea ships. They worked with startling discipline, hauling the chests up out of the holds, splitting them open, tipping the contents into the black harbour. They worked for hours. 342 chests went over the side, some 90,000 pounds of tea, and for days afterward the water was said to run brown with it along the mudflats. When they had finished, they swept the decks, set everything back in its place, and went home. One man who tried to slip a little tea into the lining of his coat was handled roughly by his own companions, because nothing was to be stolen. Nothing else was damaged. No one was hurt. That restraint was itself a statement. This was not a riot. It was a deliberate, organized act of political destruction. The disguises fooled nobody and were never truly meant to. Everyone knew who had done it and why. In time they gave it a name with a certain dark wit folded into it, the Boston Tea Party, as though the harbour itself had been asked to take a cup. Historians still argue over how directly Samuel Adams shaped the night, whether he gave the signal or simply stood back and let a machine he had built run on its own. It was the boldest defiance yet, theatrical and expensive, and it forced the whole quarrel up onto a new level. There could be no more pretending this was a family disagreement among loyal subjects. Colonists had destroyed a British company's property in open contempt of British law, and London could not let that stand. The answer came furious and hard, and in its hardness it achieved the precise opposite of what it intended. A government determined to make an example of Massachusetts and to break colonial resistance once and for all, pushed through a series of laws in 1774 that the colonists named, with grim accuracy, the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was shut completely until the ruined tea was paid for, which, for a town that lived off the sea, was a knife to the throat. The Massachusetts Charter was effectively suspended, stripping the colony of much of the self-government it treasured and handing authority to royally appointed officials. Town meetings, the beating heart of New England political life, were sharply curtailed. Royal officials accused of crimes could be shipped to England for trial, safely beyond the reach of any colonial jury. And a new law obliged colonists to find quarters for British soldiers. London expected these measures to isolate Massachusetts, frighten the rest into obedience, and finish the troublemakers. The calculation was close to perfectly inverted. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts drew the colonies together in sympathy and alarm as nothing before them ever had. The others looked at the closed harbour, the cancelled government, the soldiers in the lanes, and understood a simple thing. What had been done to one colony could be done to any of them. If a charter could be revoked and a port sealed at the pleasure of a distant ministry, then no colony's rights were worth the paper they were written on. Boston's punishment became everyone's cause. Relief began moving toward the blockaded town. Food and money and supplies sent by people who had never once set foot in Massachusetts, driven down the post roads by men who had spent their whole lives suspicious of New Englanders. And the leaders of the colonies started to feel that the hour had come to gather in one room, to consult, and to decide together what should be done. The scattered resistance was about to become something organized and continental. In the late summer and early autumn of 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies made their way toward Philadelphia, on horseback and by coach, along roads still soft from the rains. Only Georgia stayed home, the youngest colony and the most exposed, still leaning on British troops for protection against raids along its frontier and unwilling to risk them, though even Georgia was quietly sympathetic. The men who assembled called their meeting the First Continental Congress, and without quite knowing it, they were taking one of the most consequential steps in this entire story. For the first time, the colonies were not merely coordinating a boycott or objecting to one tax. They were sitting down as a body to deliberate on the whole shape of their relationship with the mother country, and to decide together what should be done about it. They were not revolutionaries, most of them, and not yet. They were men of property and standing, lawyers and merchants and planters, the leading figures of their own small worlds. They arrived carrying every possible opinion. Some, like Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, had already concluded privately that independence was both inevitable and desirable, and were far too shrewd to say so out loud. Others were moderates and conservatives who honestly wanted the breach repaired and the old warmth restored, and who found the wilder talk around them frightening. It was a gathering of rivals quite as much as allies, men who watched each other warily, uncertain whose ambition to trust. And before any of that could begin, there was a plain, practical difficulty. They hardly knew one another. These were prominent men from 13 separate societies that had spent their entire histories looking east across the Atlantic toward London, rather than sideways across their own borders. A delegate from Massachusetts and a delegate from South Carolina had likely never met, shared little in manners or temperament, and held real differences of interest. So a great deal of the early work of that Congress was simply the work of men taking one another's measure, in the formal sessions and, just as importantly, over long dinners and longer evenings in the taverns and parlours of Philadelphia. A continental movement could not be assembled out of strangers. It had to be built among men who had come to know each other, and at least partly to trust each other. John Adams of Massachusetts kept a sharp and frequently unflattering diary through those weeks, recording his fellow delegates with a lawyer's eye and a New Englander's readiness to judge. Some he thought brilliant, some he found tiresome beyond endurance, and he fretted continually that the whole assembly would talk itself hoarse and accomplish nothing at all. The Massachusetts men were in a delicate position. Theirs was the colony under direct attack, its harbour sealed, its government suspended, and they badly needed the others behind them. But they also understood that if they came across as too radical, too hungry for a fight, they would frighten the moderates and split the Congress before it could do anything. So the New England men played a careful game. They held their true feelings back. They let delegates from other colonies take the lead and be seen leading. They built agreements slowly instead of pushing the pace, which took a kind of discipline that history rarely credits. And the Congress did real work. It debated the rights of the colonies and issued a declaration of them, restating the principles they held sacred: the right to life, to liberty, to property, the right to be governed by their own assemblies, the right not to be taxed without their consent. It pronounced the intolerable acts unconstitutional and void. And it took one step with genuine teeth in it, organising a boycott of British goods more thorough and far better enforced than anything previously attempted. That was the Continental Association, and it mattered enormously. It created a web of local committees in towns and counties across the colonies, charged with enforcing the boycott, watching their neighbours, and punishing those who broke it. Consider what that actually was: a shadow government, growing up quietly alongside the official one, reaching down into every village and parish and general store. In the years ahead, it would give the resistance a structure and a reach the Crown could never match, because the Crown's authority ended at the last royal official, while the committees ended at nobody's door. At the same time, the Congress was careful, almost anxious, to profess its continuing loyalty to the king. The delegates sent a respectful petition to George III, appealing to him over the heads of his ministers, asking him to right their grievances and restore their rights. They still framed the quarrel as a dispute with Parliament and with the king's wicked advisers, never with the king himself. Some of that was sincere, for many delegates genuinely longed for reconciliation. Some of it was strategy, a way to keep the moderates in the room and to leave the door to peace propped open. They were not ready to name themselves enemies of the crown. They wanted their old rights back, and they hoped, against a rising pile of evidence, that the king might yet listen. Historians still turn over whether anything could have been repaired in that autumn, or whether the petition was already a letter sent to a house with nobody home. But beneath the courteous language, something had moved, and the delegates must have felt it, even where they would not say it. By gathering, by deliberating, by organizing a continental boycott and building committees to enforce it, the colonies had begun behaving as one political body. The machinery of resistance had been lifted out of the hands of individual colonies and given a shape that spanned the coast. When the Congress adjourned, it agreed to reconvene the following spring if the grievances had not been settled. That agreement looks almost like an afterthought in the record. It meant the colonies now possessed a standing mechanism for joint action, a body they could summon back into being whenever the crisis required it. So the First Continental Congress dissolved, and its members scattered home along the same soft roads. The thing it represented did not dissolve with it. The colonies had found a collective voice, and events were now moving faster than any man riding home through that autumn countryside understood. Because in Massachusetts the ground was already shifting. Militia companies were drilling on village greens, in the raw wind, under the eyes of their own wives and children. Powder and shot were being gathered quietly and stored inland. The British commander in Boston watched all of it and grew more alarmed with every report that reached his desk. The petitions and the declarations and the boycotts had not resolved anything. They had only cleared the stage for the moment when words would step aside and let the muskets speak. The commander was General Thomas Gage, a careful and experienced officer who happened also to have an American wife and a real understanding of the colonial temper, which made him better informed than most and no happier for it. Gage could see what was taking shape in the countryside. The militia, the ordinary farmers and townsmen who had always been expected to turn out for local defence, were drilling now with a new seriousness. They were collecting muskets, powder, and even cannon, building stores of military supply in towns beyond his reach. The shadow government was, in plain terms, preparing for the possibility of a fight, and Gage understood that if he simply waited, the colonists would only grow stronger, and the moment when he could still act decisively would slip past him. So he chose to strike first, not to begin a war, as he saw it, but to prevent one, by quietly removing the means of fighting it. Word reached him that a substantial store of supplies had been gathered at Concord, some miles inland. He resolved to send a column out by night, fast and silent, to seize and destroy it before it could be used. And if the expedition happened to lay hands on some of the leading agitators, Samuel Adams and John Hancock among them, known to be in that neighborhood, so much the better. Secrecy was everything. If the colonists learned of it in advance, they would move the stores and wake the countryside, and the whole enterprise would come to nothing. But secrecy was nearly impossible in a town as watchful as Boston, where the patriots had eyes on every wharf and in every barracks, and where it was whispered they had eyes very close to the general's own household. The resistance had built a genuine intelligence network, and it read the signs easily enough. Unusual movement among the troops, boats being brought up and made ready. On the night of the 18th of April, 1775, as the column formed up, the patriots set their warning system running. The plan was simple, and it has never been forgotten. Lanterns hung in the steeple of the Old North Church would signal the route. 1, if the soldiers went out overland. 2, if they crossed the water first. Riders would carry the alarm ahead of the marching men, waking the militia of every town along the road. The best remembered of those riders was Paul Revere, the same silversmith whose engraving had carried the image of the massacre across the colonies. He crossed the water out of Boston, took a horse on the far shore, and rode into the dark, raising the alarm from farmhouse to farmhouse. He was not alone, and this is the part the story usually loses. Other men rode other roads. Every town that woke sent out riders of its own, so that the warning multiplied as it travelled, spreading outward like rings on water. Revere himself was stopped and detained by a British patrol before he ever reached Concord, and it was another rider, a young doctor named Samuel Prescott, who carried the news the final distance. The lone horseman we picture is a simplification. What actually operated that night was a network, and it worked beautifully. By the time the soldiers were moving through the black countryside, town after town was being pulled out of sleep. Men taking down muskets kept loaded above the hearth, gathering on cold greens in the last hours before dawn. The column, several hundred strong, came into the little town of Lexington in the grey light of early morning, and found on the village green a body of local militia drawn up to meet them. Perhaps 70 men. Farmers and tradesmen, hopelessly outnumbered by the disciplined regulars standing in front of them. What happened next was confused then and has never been fully settled since. British officers shouted at the militia to disperse, to put down their arms and go home. The militia commander, seeing plainly what standing there would cost, appears to have ordered his men to withdraw without surrendering their weapons. And then, in all that crowded tension, a single shot went off. Nobody knows whose finger pulled that trigger. Each side blamed the other afterward, and the truth almost certainly dissolved in the noise of the moment. A nervous hand, an accidental discharge, a hothead on one side or the other. Historians have argued it for 2.5 centuries without resolution. But it did not matter who fired. Once it was fired, the soldiers, frightened themselves, loosed a volley into the militia and then came on with the bayonet. When the smoke lifted off Lexington Green, 8 colonists lay dead and more were wounded. The militia scattered into the fields. The British reformed and marched on toward Concord, satisfied that the morning's ugliness was behind them. They could not have been more wrong. That one shot, fired by an unknown hand on a village green at first light, would be heard, as a poet later said, around the world. At Concord, the soldiers discovered that most of the stores had already been carried off or buried, the warning having done its work through the night. They destroyed what little they found, and while they were about it, the militia of the surrounding towns was assembling on the high ground above the town, more of them arriving with every hour. At the North Bridge over the river, a body of militia advanced on the troops holding the crossing, and this time the colonists fired deliberately, killing and wounding regulars and driving the rest back across the water. The hunters had become the hunted. The British commander understood that his position was turning dangerous and that he had to get his men back to Boston quickly. But the road back to Boston was no longer a road. It was a gauntlet. Along the whole route, behind stone walls and wood piles and barn corners, the countryside had gathered. Hundreds and then thousands, pulled in by the alarm that had run all night. As the column marched, the colonists poured fire into it from cover, shooting and falling back and shooting again, refusing absolutely to stand out in the open where trained regulars could close with them. A formation built for the wide battlefields of Europe found itself bleeding mile after mile along a lane lined with invisible marksmen. Officers went down. Men fell out of the ranks. The retreat became something close to a nightmare, and the column might well have been destroyed altogether had reinforcements not come out from Boston to cover the exhausted survivors as they stumbled back into the town. By the end of that day, the British had lost far more heavily than the colonists, and the country around Boston was swarming with armed and furious men. The war nobody had quite intended had begun, and there was no path back from it. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened around Boston. The men who had chased the column back into the town did not go home. Instead, thousands more came, from Massachusetts and from the colonies beside it, streaming in along the roads until they formed a great, ragged ring around the city and shut the British army up inside it. Almost overnight, an army existed. Not a professional army with uniforms and supply trains and trained staff, but an enormous gathering of farmers and tradesmen carrying their own muskets, sorted loosely by town and by colony. General Gage, who had sent men out to disarm a handful of troublemakers, now found himself besieged by what amounted to an entire population under arms. This was the siege of Boston, and it would hold for the better part of a year. The colonists could not easily storm a city defended by warships and regulars. The British could not easily break out through an enemy that thickened by the day. So the two sides settled into a long, uneasy watchfulness across the lines, while events elsewhere kept moving. In Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened, exactly as the delegates had agreed the previous autumn, and discovered that it now had a war on its hands, whether it had wanted one or not. There was an army camped outside Boston. Somebody had to be responsible for it. This was no longer a Massachusetts quarrel. It was becoming continental. The standoff broke open in June of 1775. Word came that the British meant to seize the high ground on the peninsulas overlooking the city, ground from which artillery could dominate the harbour and the town itself. To get there first, the colonists sent men across by night onto the Charlestown Peninsula to fortify the heights. The hill that gave the battle its name was Bunker Hill, though most of the fighting happened on neighbouring Breed's Hill, a muddle of names that has tangled the telling ever since, and historians still debate whether that choice of the lower, more exposed hill was a deliberate provocation or simply a mistake made in the dark. All through those hours the colonists dug, throwing up an earthen redoubt on the crest. And when the sun came up, the British looked out from Boston to find a fortified position glaring down at them from above the rooftops. Gage and his officers chose to take the hill by direct assault, and here we watch two entirely different ideas of war collide. The British were professionals, masters of the ordered frontal attack, trained to advance in unbroken ranks and break an enemy through the steadiness of their approach and the shock of the bayonet. They formed at the base of the slope in their thousands, red coats bright in the summer light, and began to climb in perfect order. It must have been a magnificent and terrifying thing to watch from behind a dirt wall. The colonial commanders knew their men were short of powder and unsteady, and so gave the order to hold fire until the soldiers were close. So close, the legend has it, that a defender could see the whites of their eyes. When that moment came, the earthworks opened up, and the effect was ruinous. Massed fire at close range tore through the advancing ranks, and the attack shuddered, broke, and slid back down the hill in disorder, leaving the grass strewn with men. It was a stunning repulse. But British discipline was a formidable thing, and the officers gathered their shattered companies and sent them up a second time. Again the colonists waited. Again the close volleys ripped the line apart. Again the attack failed. Twice the finest army in the world had walked up that slope, and twice a crowd of farmers behind a bank of earth had thrown it back. The third assault ended differently, not because British courage had increased, but because the colonists' powder had run out. Having spent nearly everything they had repelling the first two attacks, the defenders had almost nothing left to meet the third. Their fire thinned, faltered, and stopped, and the redcoats came over the top of the works with the bayonet. The fighting at the wall was savage and short. Then the colonists, out of ammunition and unable to stand against steel, gave up the hill and fell back. Behind them, Charlestown itself was burning, set alight by naval guns, so that the whole engagement had been fought against a backdrop of a town going up in flame. The British held the ground when the day ended. By the strict arithmetic of the battlefield, they had won. It was a victory that felt like a wound, and everybody on both sides understood that. The cost had been appalling, more than 1,000 men killed or wounded out of the force engaged, and among them a dreadful number of officers. They had bought a single hill at a price no army could pay more than a few times. One British officer, looking over the slope afterward, is said to have remarked that a few more victories of that kind would finish them entirely, and he was exactly right. The colonists had lost heavily too, and among their dead was Joseph Warren, one of the most respected Patriot leaders in Massachusetts, who had come out to the redoubt to stand in the line as an ordinary volunteer. The battle taught both sides something sobering. It taught the British that these untrained colonists would stand and fight and kill, that there would be no brisk police action against a rabble, but a real and bloody war. And it taught the colonists that they could face the best soldiers in the world and make them pay for every yard, that the redcoats were not invincible, that ordinary men with muskets and nerve could hold a line against an empire. Bunker Hill gave the colonial cause the one thing it most needed in that early, uncertain summer, which was confidence. And it gave the British a grim taste of the length of the road in front of them. This would not be settled in a single season. It would grind on for years. Which left the men in Philadelphia with an urgent problem. They had an army, of a sort, and no one to lead it. What they had was a sprawling collection of New England militia, held together by shared anger and a common enemy, with no unified command, no proper organization, and no authority over it beyond the towns and colonies that had sent the men out. If this was to be a continental war, that gathering would have to become a continental army, and a continental army needed one commander whom every colony could accept and follow. The choice the Congress made was practical and quietly shrewd, and it turned out to be among the most important decisions in the whole life of the nation that followed. The force around Boston was overwhelmingly a New England force, and there was a genuine danger that the rest of the coast would come to see the struggle as a New England quarrel, a regional business the southern and middle colonies could watch from a safe distance. To stitch the colonies together, the commander ought to come from outside New England, and his appointment would itself be a statement that this was a common cause. So the Congress turned to one of its own delegates from Virginia, a tall, reserved, formally dignified planter who had served with distinction in the French and Indian War, and who had lately taken to attending the sessions in his old military coat, a quiet signal that needed no explaining. His name was George Washington. He was in many ways an inspired choice, though not because he possessed the finest military mind of his age. He did not. He had tasted real defeat already in that wilderness 20 years before, and he would taste a great deal more of it in the years ahead. His gifts lay elsewhere, and they happened to be precisely the gifts the moment required. He carried an immense personal dignity and an unusual command of himself, a presence that drew confidence out of a room simply by entering it. He was a Southerner, and his appointment knitted the colonies closer. He was wealthy enough to serve without pay, and made a point of refusing a salary, asking only that his expenses be covered, which impressed everybody and marked him quietly as a man standing above ordinary ambition. He kept the accounts himself, to the penny, for 8 years, and above all, he possessed something rarer than brilliance and far more useful across a long war, which was endurance. Washington could absorb defeat, hold a broken army together through disaster and despair, and simply decline to stop. In a struggle that would be settled not by one dazzling stroke, but by the sheer capacity to keep going, year after miserable year, that was worth more than genius. When he reached the camp outside Boston in the summer of 1775 and took command, he was dismayed by what he found, and he did not entirely trouble to hide it. The men were brave enough. They were also undisciplined, disorganized, and deeply resistant to the sort of order he believed an army had to have. They had little feeling for hierarchy. In many companies they elected their own officers. They came and went more or less as it suited them, and they regarded the formal discipline of European armies with the suspicion of free men who had picked up muskets precisely to avoid being ordered about. The camps were filthy, supplies were short, and enlistments ran for terms so brief that the army threatened to dissolve and reassemble every few months, as men's time expired and they walked home to get the crop in. So Washington set himself to the slow, thankless, unglamorous labour of turning a crowd of armed citizens into something that could be called an army. He imposed discipline. He organised the camps and the sanitation. He built a chain of command and worked without pause to keep his force fed and clothed and present. The romantic picture of the revolution is all charges and colours and drums. The truer picture of Washington's war is a man sitting up late by a single candle, writing yet another desperate letter to Congress, asking for money, for shoes, for powder, for longer enlistments, for the barest means of keeping his army from evaporating in the night. His most persistent enemy was rarely the British. It was hunger, desertion, expiring enlistments, and the endless grinding shortage of everything an army requires. The siege dragged through the rest of 1775 and into the first months of 1776, two armies watching each other across the works, while Washington struggled to hold his together. What finally broke the deadlock was a piece of initiative and a feat of hauling that ought to be better known than it is. Far to the west, colonial forces had taken a British post, Fort Ticonderoga, and with it a quantity of heavy cannon. A resourceful young officer named Henry Knox, a former Boston bookseller with an amateur's passion for artillery, proposed to bring those guns to Boston. Nearly 60 pieces of heavy metal, dragged 300 miles on ox-drawn sledges across frozen rivers and through winter forest, in a season when the roads were not roads. That the guns arrived at all was close to a miracle. They changed everything. Washington had them hauled by night up onto the heights of Dorchester, high ground looking down on the town and the harbour. The whole operation completed in a single darkness, so that the British woke to find the hills above them bristling with artillery, exactly as the colonists had once presented them with a redoubt on Breed's Hill. But these positions were too strong to storm, and the guns commanded the anchorage where the fleet lay. General Howe, who had replaced Gage in command, faced an unlovely choice. He could assault the heights and risk another Bunker Hill, or something worse. Or he could give up the city. He chose to give it up. In March of 1776, the British Army, together with a crowd of loyalist refugees who dared not stay, boarded their ships and sailed out of Boston Harbor, leaving the town in colonial hands. Historians still discuss whether an unspoken understanding passed between the two commanders in those days, the fleet allowed to leave unmolested in exchange for leaving Boston unburned. Nothing was written down, which is rather the point of such arrangements. It was a tremendous victory, and it had cost almost no blood, and it lifted colonial spirits higher than anything since Bunker Hill. Church bells rang in towns that had never seen a soldier. Washington permitted himself no illusions at all. The British had not been beaten. They had withdrawn to gather their strength, and they would return in far greater force. The war was not ending. It was only beginning, and the colonies were about to take a step from which there would be no walking back. Through that whole first year of fighting, a strange contradiction had been running underneath the colonial cause, and it could not hold much longer. The colonists were at war with their king's armies, while still officially professing their devotion to that same king, still insisting they sought only the restoration of their rights as British subjects, and nothing so drastic as separation. They were fighting a war they refused to name. Men had died on Lexington Green and on the slope above Charlestown, in the name of liberties they claimed as Englishmen, while the Congress sent yet another humble petition across the water, asking for reconciliation. Sooner or later, they would have to say plainly what they were fighting for. Several things pushed them towards saying it in the early months of 1776. The king helped considerably. He refused even to receive their final petition. pronounced the colonies in open rebellion, and set about hiring foreign soldiers, Germans, to help put them down. The news that their own sovereign was paying strangers to come across an ocean and shoot at them landed on the colonies like cold water. Much of the lingering affection people still carried for the crown simply drained away. It is very difficult to go on addressing a monarch as a benevolent father, while he is engaging mercenaries to fire on your sons. The feeling of being loyal subjects appealing upward gave way to the feeling of being a people abandoned. And then there was a pamphlet, one of the most consequential things ever printed. In the first days of 1776, a recent immigrant from England, a corset maker's son named Thomas Paine, published a slim work he called Common Sense. And it did what none of the careful gentlemen in Congress had dared. It went after not only Parliament, not only the King's ministers, but the whole institution of monarchy, root and branch. And it made its case in plain, blazing language any farmer or apprentice could follow, that the colonies should cut the cord and govern themselves. Paine brushed aside the delicate distinctions and the timid hopes, and said the unsayable out loud, that it was an absurdity for an entire continent to be governed by a distant island, that hereditary kingship was a ridiculous and corrupting arrangement, that the hour for independence had arrived. He published it anonymously at first, described only as the work of an Englishman, and it sold in numbers no American publication had ever approached, well past 100,000 copies within months, in a country of 2.5 million people. It was read aloud in taverns and around kitchen fires to those who could not read it themselves. Paine took almost nothing from it, directing his share towards supplies for the army instead. What the pamphlet gave ordinary people were the words for something they had already begun to feel and had not dared to speak. It made independence thinkable, and then it made independence obvious. By that summer, the momentum had turned irresistible. Inside the Congress, the radicals who had privately believed in separation for years now watched the moderates arrive at the same place, pushed there by the King's actions, by Paine's arguments, and by the simple logic of a war that admitted no other ending. A resolution was introduced declaring the colonies free and independent states, and the Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration setting out for the world why the colonies were cutting themselves loose. The committee included John Adams and the venerable Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, printer, scientist, diplomat, the most famous American alive. But the writing itself was handed to a young Virginia delegate, a quiet, bookish, formidably gifted lawyer named Thomas Jefferson, whose talent for language his colleagues had already noticed. Jefferson worked over the document in his rented rooms in the summer heat, drawing on a whole inheritance of political thought, on the Enlightenment, on the long, slow English argument about liberty, and distilling all of it into something startlingly clear. At its heart, he set down a handful of propositions he called self-evident: that all men are created equal, that they hold certain rights no power may take from them, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness; that governments draw their just authority from the consent of those they govern, and exist to protect those rights; and that when a government turns against that purpose, the people may rightfully alter or abolish it. With those sentences, the quarrel was lifted out of taxes and trade and planted in something universal, a claim about human beings and the proper foundation of any government at all. It was a justification not only for this rebellion but, in principle, for the rights of people anywhere. When he submitted the draft, the Congress went through it line by line, and the experience nearly broke the sensitive young author's heart as delegates trimmed and reworked his careful prose. Franklin sat beside him, offering gentle consolation on the hazards of handing one's writing to a committee. Most of the changes were small. One was enormous. Jefferson had included a passage bitterly condemning the slave trade and laying it at the King's feet, and the Congress struck it out, in part to satisfy delegates from colonies whose wealth rested on slavery. So the document proclaiming that all men are created equal was edited at the moment of its birth to shelter the institution of human bondage. That contradiction we noticed at the very beginning of this story was written directly into the founding. The men who put their names to it understood precisely what they were doing. In the eyes of the Crown, this was treason, and treason was punished at the end of a rope. To sign was to stake life, fortune, and honour on the rebellion succeeding, because if it failed, there would be no mercy for the signatories. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. It was read aloud in public squares, printed and carried down the roads, sent to the army and read out to the soldiers standing in their ranks. Historians will remind you that most of the delegates did not actually sign until the 2nd of August, and that the famous parchment was still being signed by latecomers for months afterward, so that the date the nation celebrates is the date of a decision rather than of a signature. The colonies were no longer rebellious provinces seeking redress. By their own declaration, they were free and independent states, a new nation announcing itself to the world. There was no returning now to the comfortable old arrangement, no reconciliation left to hope for. It was independence or ruin. And the British, who had spent that spring assembling an enormous force to end the rebellion in a single stroke, were about to test whether the bold words of July could survive the summer. Even while the declaration was being read out in the squares, the largest military force Britain had ever sent across an ocean was gathering in the waters off New York. They had learned from Boston. They would not sit down again outside a hostile New England town and wait to be starved out. Instead, they would take New York City, a port of real importance, a place with a large loyalist population, and above all, a base from which they could control the Hudson and perhaps split the rebellion in half, cutting New England off from everything south of it. The force assembled for the work was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of disciplined regulars and hired German troops, carried and supported by a great fleet, the whole enterprise commanded by General William Howe and his brother the Admiral. It was a hammer built to break the rebellion in one campaign. Washington, expecting the blow, marched his army down from Boston to defend the city, and the task was very nearly impossible from the first day. New York sits on islands. Islands are surrounded by water, and water belonged absolutely to the Royal Navy. Washington had no fleet worth the name, which meant the British could put troops ashore wherever they pleased and shift them by sea faster than he could march to meet them. To hold a city of islands against an enemy who owned the sea, with an army smaller, greener, and far worse equipped, is the kind of problem that has no good answer. He tried anyway, partly because Congress and the public expected New York to be defended, and the attempt came close to destroying his army and the cause with it. What unfolded across the late summer and autumn of 1776 was a chronicle of defeat. The British landed in strength and met him in battle on Long Island, where weight of numbers and a clever march around his flank collapsed the American position and drove the survivors back in disorder into the fortified lines at Brooklyn. And there Washington stood, with a river at his back and a victorious enemy in front of him, facing the annihilation of his entire force. Had Howe pushed the attack home that day, the war might have ended before it properly began. Instead, Howe, perhaps with the slope above Charlestown still in his memory, chose caution and prepared to lay siege rather than storm. Historians still argue about that decision, whether it was simple prudence or the reluctance of a man who had been sent to conquer people he still hoped to reconcile. The caution gave Washington a night, and he used it for one of the most skillful operations of his life, ferrying his whole army across the East River in small boats in the dark, helped by a fog that came up at exactly the right hour, so that the British woke to find the lines in front of them empty. He had saved the army. He had also lost the battle, and the retreat was only starting. What came next was a long, grinding withdrawal, a season of almost unbroken misfortune. The British landed on Manhattan and pushed him out of the city. When an important fort on the heights fell, they took thousands of his men along with quantities of supplies he could never replace. Those prisoners went into hulks anchored in the harbour, and more Americans would die in those foul prison ships over the course of the war than fell in all its battles put together, a fact that has never sat comfortably in the story and is usually left out of it. Washington retreated north, then west across the Hudson, then south through New Jersey, with the British close behind. His force shrank with every mile of it. Men deserted, enlistments ran out, and men simply walked home. The sick and the disheartened dropped away by the roadside. An army that had counted many thousands in August was down to a few thousand cold, hungry, ragged men by December, moving across a bleak winter landscape with the enemy at their heels and nothing visible ahead but the end. These were the darkest days of the whole war, the point at which the entire enterprise came nearest to simply dissolving. The cause proclaimed with such confidence in July looked, by December, like something dying. The British seemed unbeatable. Across an overrun New Jersey, many people quietly made their peace with the Crown, accepted the offered pardons, and stepped away from a lost cause. Because that is what sensible people do when a cause is lost. Thomas Paine was with the army through that retreat, and he caught the mood exactly in a new pamphlet, opening with the line about these being the times that try men's souls, observing that the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot would shrink from service in such a crisis, and that those who stood firm now deserved the love and thanks of every man and woman in the country. He wrote it, so the story goes, on a drumhead by firelight during the march, which sounds like something invented afterward, and happens to be roughly true. For Washington, the position was close to hopeless, and he understood it with a clarity that would have flattened a lesser man. His army was coming apart in front of him, and there was a date on the calendar making everything worse, because the enlistments of much of what remained were due to expire with the end of the year, only weeks away. On the 1st of January, most of his soldiers would have the legal right to walk away, and a great many of them certainly would, leaving him with the shell of a command and no means of continuing. If the war was to be saved, something had to happen before the year ran out. Some stroke that could turn the tide of defeat, put confidence back into an army that had forgotten the feeling, and give men a reason to stay when they had every right to leave. The odds against finding such a stroke were considerable. He had been beaten across the whole long campaign, beaten and beaten again, and beaten men are not usually the ones who find brilliant openings. But in the last desperate days of 1776, with his cause apparently in its final hours, Washington conceived something as bold as it was reckless, a gamble that would either revive the revolution or finish it off for good. He turned his eyes east, across the ice-choked Delaware, where the enemy lay comfortable in winter quarters, careless and certain, in no doubt at all that the rebel army was finished. The plan he devised in those final days of the year was audacious to the edge of recklessness, which was precisely what the situation called for. His army had crossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania, and as it went, it had gathered up every boat for miles along the bank, so that the pursuing British could not follow. On the far shore, in New Jersey, the British and their German auxiliaries had spread themselves comfortably into winter quarters, settling into the river towns to wait out the cold before finishing the rebellion off in spring. That was simply how war was done in that age. Armies did not campaign in snow and ice if they could avoid it. Roads turned to grease, powder damped, men sickened. The enemy felt safe, and by every reasonable measure they were safe. The rebel army was beaten, shrinking, and stranded on the wrong side of a frozen river. No sane commander would attack, which was exactly the reason Washington chose to attack. In the town of Trenton, just across the water, sat a garrison of German troops, professional soldiers hired to put down the rebellion. Washington reasoned that a sudden blow from an unexpected direction, in the dead of winter, might catch them entirely unready. If it worked, his dying cause would have a victory, any victory. Something to hold up to the world and to his own vanishing army as proof that the war had not yet been lost. He would cross in secret on the night after Christmas, march through the dark, and fall on the town at first light. The watchword he gave his officers for that night was victory or death, which tells you exactly how narrow he understood the margin to be. The crossing very nearly ended it all before it began. The night of the 25th of December, 1776, was bitterly cold, and the weather worsened as the army gathered at the landing. The Delaware ran thick with great slabs of floating ice, grinding and turning in the current, knocking against the boats. Then came sleet, and then snow, driving down on men already frozen as they loaded themselves and their horses and their cannon into the flat-bottomed craft. Picture the sound of it. Ice against timber, hooves on wet planking, rope, low voices, no drums, no light, nothing but the river working against them in the dark, hour after hour, while the schedule slipped further and further behind. Other crossings meant to support the attack failed altogether, beaten by the ice and the weather, so that Washington's column would have to do the whole thing alone. By the time the army was assembled on the New Jersey bank, it was far later than planned, and any hope of striking before dawn was gone. He went on anyway. There was nothing behind him to go back to. The exhausted, half-frozen column marched through the storm toward Trenton in the grey of early morning, and some of the men, it was said, left blood in the snow behind them, their feet wrapped in rags instead of shod in boots that no one had been able to supply. They reached the town and fell on the garrison in a sudden, furious rush. The German soldiers, taken completely unprepared, roused from their quarters straight into a chaos of musket fire and shouting, never managed to form a proper defence. Their commander was mortally wounded early. The fight was sharp and short. Hundreds of the garrison were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, and Washington's own losses were almost nothing. The old story that the Hessians were sleeping off a Christmas drunk has been picked apart by historians and does not hold. They were simply professional soldiers who had every reason to believe no attack could possibly come that morning. In a single winter dawn, a beaten and despairing rebel army had won a clean and startling victory. Measured in ground and numbers, Trenton was modest. Measured in spirit, it was enormous, entirely out of proportion to its size. At the very moment the revolution seemed to be expiring, with defeat piled on defeat, and the army melting away by the day, Washington had struck back and won. The news ran through the colonies and lifted flagging hopes everywhere. It gave his soldiers something to believe again, and, most practically of all, it persuaded a great many men whose enlistments were expiring to stay on a while longer instead of going home. One victory changes everything when men have grown accustomed to losing. He did not stop there. Sensing the initiative had shifted into his hands, he crossed back into New Jersey and struck again. The British, stung by Trenton, sent a strong force to trap and destroy his little army, and for a few hours he was nearly caught, pinned against a creek with a superior enemy closing in and a battle expected at dawn. So on the night before it, he slipped away once more, and did it beautifully. He left his campfires burning and men making the ordinary noises of a camp settling for the night, and marched his army quietly around the British flank in the dark, wheels muffled, along frozen back roads. At Princeton the next morning he came down on another British force and beat it, then withdrew into the hills of New Jersey and safe winter quarters. In roughly 10 days he had changed the entire complexion of the war. He had taken an army on the point of dissolution and a cause on the point of collapse, and with sheer nerve and refusal had won 2 victories that put life back into both. The British, who in December had considered the rebellion effectively finished, were forced to draw back and think again. They gave up much of New Jersey, surrendering ground they had believed securely theirs. And the country people, who had been quietly making their peace with the crown, took their heart back. The story of the Revolution had come within a few frozen nights of ending in the snow of that terrible December, with a broken army and a dying cause. Instead, improbably, it had been carried across an icy river in open boats and set back on its feet. The war was nowhere near over. Years of hard fighting still lay ahead, and defeats to come that would rival the disasters of 1776. But the cause had survived its darkest hour, and as the armies settled into their winter quarters, people up and down the coast could once again allow themselves to imagine that independence might actually be won. Before we follow the fighting into its next great turning, let us step off the road for a while and look at the world all of this was happening to. Beneath the marching and the cannon, ordinary life went on, and understanding that life is part of understanding the revolution. This was a society sharply divided by rank and wealth, far more so than later American storytelling has liked to remember, and a person's place in that order shaped nearly everything about how they lived, dressed, ate, and were spoken to. At the top stood the gentry, the great merchants of the northern ports and the great planters of the south. These were the families with money and influence, the men who sat in the assemblies, led the Congress, and commanded the army. A wealthy planter like Washington, or a prosperous Philadelphia merchant, lived in a fine house of brick or stone with many rooms, furnished with imported things, and was waited on by enslaved people or paid servants. The gentry dressed to be read at a glance. The men in well-cut coats and waistcoats of fine cloth, in breeches and silk stockings and buckled shoes, their hair powdered or covered by a wig, because a powdered head announced a man who did not work with his hands. Their women wore elaborate gowns of silk and fine cotton, layered over stays and petticoats, every fold of it a statement. They ate well, meat and fish and imported delicacies, wine and Madeira and the disputed tea, off proper china at tables laid with silver. Below them came the broad, middling sort, and this was the true heart of colonial society, far larger and in the end far more important than the elite above it. Independent farmers who owned their own acres, artisans and craftsmen in the towns, shopkeepers, tradesmen, lesser professionals. A middling farmer worked his own fields with his family, and perhaps a hired hand or two, and lived in a modest, comfortable wooden house. The men dressed plainly in coats and breeches of sturdy wool or linen, clothing made to be worked in rather than looked at. Much of it was spun and woven at home, and during the boycotts, homespun cloth became a badge of virtue, a way of wearing one's politics where the neighbours could see it. Their food was plain and filling, and came mostly from their own ground: bread and cornmeal, pork and salt fish, beans and garden vegetables, cider in the cup. They ate to be fueled for labour, and they ate with the seasons, salting and preserving against the winter. Below the middling sort were the labouring poor, those who owned no land and worked for other men. Hired hands and servants, labourers and sailors, journeymen practising another man's trade for wages. Their lives were harder and far less certain, their clothes rougher, patched, handed down, their food simpler and sometimes short. A great many had begun by selling years of their own labour for passage across the Atlantic, bound to a master as indentured servants until the term was served. They stood a step above the bottom and always within sight of want. And at the very bottom, outside the ladder of free society altogether, were the enslaved. Hundreds of thousands of people of African descent held in bondage across the colonies, most heavily in the South. They owned nothing at all, not even themselves. They worked the plantation fields and the kitchens and the workshops, wore the coarsest cloth their owners provided, ate the cheapest rations, and lived entirely at the pleasure of men who claimed to possess them. The grand talk of liberty filling the air in those years did not pass over their heads. They heard it perfectly well, and the contradiction was not subtle. Many saw in the war a dangerous opening and took it. The royal governor of Virginia had already proclaimed freedom for enslaved men who would leave rebel masters and take up arms for the king. And some of those who did went into the field with the words about liberty stitched across their breasts. Thousands more escaped in the confusion of the fighting, though historians are still working out how many, since nobody was keeping careful count of people they refused to see as people. For the enslaved, this war over liberty was a complicated and perilous chance to seize a liberty of their own. Beyond all these ranks, the ordinary rhythms of the day would feel strange to us now. Light came from the hearth and from candles, so the day followed the sun, and the dark hours were long and quiet in a way we have almost lost. Warmth came from the fire, around which the household gathered and over which the food was cooked. Water was carried by hand. Travel was slow, by horse or wagon over rough roads, or by boat along the rivers and the coast. Disease sat close to every family, and medicine could do very little against it, so that parents expected to bury children and braced themselves for the seasons when sickness came through. Religion ran deep through all of it, shaping the calendar, the moral vocabulary, the sense of what a life was for, though it varied enormously, from the stern Protestant inheritance of New England to the established Anglican order of Virginia, to the extraordinary patchwork of faiths in Pennsylvania. Women in this world, whatever their rank, lived in profound legal and social subordination. Their lives were defined by household and family, and on marriage their property and legal identity were absorbed into their husbands. And yet inside those walls they ran the whole complicated economy of a household, and when the men marched away, they ran the farms and the shops and the accounts as well. The boycotts leaned on women more than on anyone, because women decided what a household would and would not buy, and women spun the homespun that replaced the imports. The revolution reached into the kitchen and the spinning room quite as surely as it reached the battlefield. That was the society, layered and unequal, devout and hard-working, that the war was being fought over and through. The soaring words about equality and rights were spoken in a world that was nothing like equal, by men standing near the top of a very steep ladder. The distance between the ideal and the reality was wide, and it would stay wide for generations. But an ideal, once written down and read aloud in public squares, acquires a life of its own. It goes on pressing against the reality long after the men who wrote it have gone quiet. That pressure would outlast every man in this story. For now, though, the outcome of the war still hung in the balance, and far to the north, in the forests along the lakes, a British plan was already unfolding that would carry the whole conflict to its first great turning point. In 1777, the British settled on a grand strategy that they were confident would end the rebellion by cutting it in two, and on paper it had a real logic to it. New England was the heart of the thing, the most defiant and committed region on the coast. Sever New England from the rest, the reasoning went, and the revolution could be strangled at leisure. The way to do it lay along a corridor drawn by geography itself, the chain of lakes and rivers running down from Canada to the Hudson and on to New York City. Take that whole corridor, hold it, and the colonies would be split, New England isolated, the rebellion broken apart and finished piece by piece. So an army would march south out of Canada, through the Lake Country, and eventually link hands with forces pushing north from New York, sealing the corridor between them. The Northern Army was led by General John Burgoyne, a confident and rather theatrical officer, a man fond of fine living, grand gestures and writing plays. He set out southward in the summer of 1777 with a substantial force of British regulars German troops, Canadians and native allies, a long train of artillery, and a baggage train said to include a generous provision of the general's personal comforts, the champagne among them. He began well. Fort Ticonderoga fell to him with surprising ease, which dismayed the Americans and delighted London, and Burgoyne pressed south, certain of success. Then the plan began to come apart against the country itself. The land between Canada and the Hudson was rough, thickly forested, threaded with rivers and swamp, and the Americans set about making his progress a misery. They felled trees across the trails, broke the bridges, dammed and choked the streams, so that an army weighed down with heavy guns and baggage had to hack and build its way forward, laying road as it went, its advance slowing to a few painful miles a day. Its supply line stretched back through hostile country, growing longer and thinner with every mile of it, and the force that was supposed to come up the Hudson to meet him never came. The reasons were British reasons, muddled communication and competing ambitions, one general pursuing his own campaign in another direction entirely. Historians have argued about it ever since, whether the orders were badly written, badly sent, or never truly sent at all, and whether one man's choice to sail for Philadelphia instead of north up the river cost Britain the war. Burgoyne kept marching toward a meeting that was never going to happen, deeper and deeper into a country that was quietly closing behind him. The people did not welcome him as a liberator. As his column came on, and as word spread of settlers killed in raids by his native allies, the militia of New England and New York turned out in numbers nobody in London had thought possible, thickening the American force gathering in his path. A detachment he sent off to collect supplies and horses was ambushed and destroyed by militia, a sharp loss of hundreds of men he had no means of replacing, and a plain warning that the whole countryside was rising around him. Every week his army grew weaker and lonelier, its supplies thinner, its road home longer, while the Americans in front of it grew stronger. The bold stroke to split the colonies had become a trap, and Burgoyne was walking into the jaws of it with his guns and his wine. The American army waiting for him was commanded by General Horatio Gates, though the fighting itself was driven largely by the aggression of other officers and by the sheer weight of militia that had assembled out of the farms and villages. Among those who distinguished themselves in the hard fighting was a brilliant and reckless field commander named Benedict Arnold, whose name would one day become a synonym for betrayal, and who in these battles fought with conspicuous courage and considerable skill, taking a wound in the leg that never properly healed. The two armies collided in a series of fierce engagements that autumn, near a place on the Hudson called Saratoga. The fighting was bloody and stubborn, and the British gave a good account of themselves, but they could not break the American position, and every action left Burgoyne weaker, while the Americans, continually reinforced, grew stronger. After the second great battle, he found himself in an impossible place. His army was battered, outnumbered, short of food, ringed by a growing American host, and cut off from any hope of relief or of retreat. There was nothing left to do. In October of 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army. Thousands of British and German soldiers laid down their arms in the open field before men who, 18 months earlier, had been farmers with fowling pieces. It was the greatest American victory of the war so far, an entire enemy army taken whole, and its consequences travelled far beyond that stretch of river. Because Saratoga did something the Americans needed even more than captured muskets and guns. It convinced France. France, Britain's great rival, had been watching this war with sharp interest, quietly passing along some aid in the hope of weakening an old enemy, but declining to commit openly. No French minister wished to risk a war with Britain on behalf of a rebellion that might collapse next season. Benjamin Franklin had been in Paris for many months by then, working with all his formidable charm and cunning to draw them in, playing the part of the plain-spoken philosopher from the forests so successfully that Parisian ladies wore their hair in imitation of his fur cap. Still, the French had hesitated, waiting to see whether these people could actually win anything. Saratoga was the proof they had been waiting for. Here was an American army that had captured a British army in the field. The rebellion was real. These men could fight and win, and the moment to strike at Britain had come. In the wake of Saratoga, France agreed to a formal alliance with the United States, recognized American independence, and entered the war. And with that, the entire character of the conflict changed. What had begun as a quarrel over stamped paper and a colonial rebellion became a world war, with the power of France, her armies, and above all her great navy, thrown into the scale against Britain. The Americans were no longer alone. But the winter that followed the triumph would test them more cruelly than any battle had. It came not from an enemy army, but from a cold hillside in the Pennsylvania countryside. The campaigning of 1777 had gone badly in the middle colonies. Washington had failed to keep the British out of Philadelphia, the American capital, and with the city occupied, he led his tired army into winter quarters some miles outside it, at a place called Valley Forge. There it would wait out the cold, and there it would suffer, not under fire but from hunger, exposure, disease, and the chronic breakdown of supply that had shadowed the cause from the first day. The army that settled in during December of 1777 was in a wretched condition. The men built rough log huts against the weather in neat military rows, and shelter turned out to be the least of what they lacked. Food failed for days at a stretch as the supply system collapsed, and men ate what they called fire cake, flour and water baked on a hot stone, and little else. Clothing failed. Many were in rags. Shoes failed altogether, so that bloody footprints in the snow, which had marked the road to Trenton the winter before, became an ordinary sight through those months. There were not enough blankets, there was almost no medicine, and disease moved easily through a crowded, underfed, half-clothed camp, so that thousands died over the course of that winter, not in battle, but of sickness and cold and simple want. It was a slow agony, and it tested the army and its commander more severely than any engagement had. The bitter part is that the suffering was largely a failure of organization rather than of resources. There was food in America. There was cloth in America. The problem was moving it to the men who needed it, and that was a problem of money, of administration, of a Congress with no power to tax, and of a supply system riddled with inefficiency and, here and there, with outright theft. Washington filled that winter with letters, describing what his soldiers were enduring, and warning plainly that the army might simply dissolve if it were not fed. Martha Washington came up from Virginia to spend the winter in camp, as she did most winters of the war, sewing and visiting the sick, which the soldiers noticed and remembered. Historians will tell you Valley Forge was not even the coldest winter the army endured, that a later encampment at Morristown was harsher by the thermometer, and yet it is Valley Forge that lodged in memory, because of what happened there. That the army held together at all, through cold and hunger and death, owed everything to the endurance of the men who stayed, and to the steadiness of a commander who lived among them and would not leave them. Washington's great achievement that winter was simply this, that when spring came, there was still an army. But Valley Forge was not only a place of suffering, it was also, remarkably, where the Continental Army became a genuine army. The agent of that change was a foreign volunteer, a Prussian officer named Friedrich von Steuben, who arrived at the camp in the worst of the winter offering his services. He had served in the army of Frederick the Great, the finest military machine in Europe, and he carried in his head the drill and discipline and organization that made European armies so formidable. What he found was a force full of brave men who had never been properly trained, who could not maneuver in formation, who handled their weapons each in his own way, who fought as a collection of individuals rather than as units. So he taught them, with enormous energy and a temper that became legendary around the fires. He spoke almost no English at first, and would roar his commands in a mixture of German and French, cursing magnificently in several languages when the men got it wrong, his oaths relayed to the troops by aides struggling to keep pace with him. He drilled them without mercy all winter, beginning with one model company he trained himself, and then using those men to carry the new methods out through the whole army. He taught them to march and wheel, to load and fire together, to use the bayonet, to shift from column into line and back again under fire. He wrote a manual of drill and regulation that would standardize the training of American soldiers for years. And slowly, across that long, miserable winter, the ragged men of Valley Forge turned into something they had never been. A disciplined army, capable of standing and maneuvering against British regulars on equal terms. The difference showed as soon as they marched out. When the British gave up Philadelphia and moved back toward New York, Washington followed them, and the two armies met at Monmouth in New Jersey in the summer of 1778, in heat so fearful that men on both sides dropped where they stood. There the Continental Army showed how far it had come. The Americans held their ground against British regulars, manoeuvred with a new steadiness, and stayed on the field at the end of the day. It was not a decisive victory. It was proof, which mattered more. The army forged in that winter's misery could meet the British in open battle on something near even terms. The cold and the hunger had bought something real. And now the strategic picture had shifted too. With France in the war, Britain faced a global conflict, obliged to defend possessions and interests scattered across the world, no longer able to throw her whole strength at 13 rebellious colonies. Spain would come in, and the Dutch after, pulling still more British ships and men away to other oceans. The American war became one theatre among several, which is a very different thing from being the only fight that matters. Unable to break the rebellion in the north, where Washington's reinvigorated army stood squarely in the way and stretched thin across a widening war, the British began looking elsewhere for a road to victory. They turned their eyes to the south, to the colonies where they believed loyal sentiment still ran deepest, hoping to find there the welcome and the success that had escaped them everywhere else. The war was about to enter its most brutal phase, fought across the Carolinas and Georgia in long marches, hard sieges, and a savage struggle between neighbours. The reasoning behind the new plan was hopeful, and it turned out to be badly mistaken. The British believed the southern colonies were full of loyalists, colonists still faithful to the crown, who would rally to the king's standard the moment a British army arrived to shelter and encourage them. So the design was to use regulars to seize the key southern points, then raise and arm the loyal population, and reconquer the south colony by colony, rolling the rebellion up from the bottom. Everything in it depended on those loyalists being as numerous, as committed, and as willing to fight as London imagined. Historians are still arguing over the true numbers, and the honest answer is that the loyalists were many but scattered, and that scattered men do not make an army. At first, the strategy looked brilliant. Savannah fell. Then, in 1780, the British struck at Charleston, the great port and the most important city in the South, and the campaign ended in catastrophe for the Americans. A substantial American army was trapped inside the city and forced to surrender. Thousands of soldiers and an enormous quantity of arms and supplies gone at a single stroke. It ranked with the worst defeats of the entire war, a Charleston to match the disasters around New York 4 years before. With the city taken and a whole American army removed from the board, the British seemed poised to sweep the South, and they pushed inland to finish the work. And the deeper they pushed, the more the plan came apart, for reasons that showed the real nature of this war in the South. The Great Loyalist Rising never came, not on the scale that had been counted on. There were loyalists in abundance, and the South was bitterly, violently divided against itself. But there were also fierce patriots, and the arrival of a British army did not pacify the country. it set it alight. The southern back country dissolved into a savage internal war, a war of ambush and reprisal, of night raids and burnings and killings, neighbour against neighbour, in which the formal armies were almost a sideshow to the local slaughter. British troops and their loyalist allies committed harsh acts that pushed waverers straight into the Patriot camp, because nothing makes a rebel faster than a burned house and a dead cousin. At one hill in the Carolinas, an entire loyalist force was surrounded and destroyed by frontier militia who had ridden in from over the mountains on their own initiative. And after that, the loyalists of the region thought harder before turning out. The Continental forces in the south were rebuilt after Charleston under a new commander, Nathaniel Greene, a former Rhode Island foundryman who turned out to be one of the ablest generals America produced in that whole war. Greene understood plainly that he could not beat the British in a straight contest of strength, so he fought a different kind of war altogether, one of movement and attrition, designed not to win battles, but to wear an enemy down until winning became impossible for him. He divided his forces and made the British chase them across hundreds of miles of difficult country, rivers and mud and heat. He sent one wing off under an old frontier fighter who turned and destroyed a pursuing British column at a place called Cowpens, with a trap so neat it is still taught in staff colleges. And he fought engagements in which, even when driven from the field, he left the British with losses they had no means of replacing. He is supposed to have summed up his method by saying that he fought, was beaten, rose, and fought again. And that is the campaign in one line. He lost the battles and won the war in the south, bleeding the British army thinner with every meeting, so that each of their victories left them weaker than before it. General Charles Cornwallis, commanding in the south, found himself caught in precisely the trap Greene was building. His victories cost him men he could not get back. His supply lines were harassed without rest. The loyalist support never came to enough, and the country would not be pacified. He marched and fought and won and grew weaker, chasing an enemy who would not be pinned down and who somehow strengthened as his own force thinned. Worn out by a long, inconclusive campaign in the Carolinas, unable to force the war to any kind of conclusion, Cornwallis made a fateful decision. He would take his army north into Virginia, where he hoped for a better strategic picture and perhaps a decisive result at last. He moved to a place on the Virginia coast, a small tobacco port, sitting on a neck of land where the Royal Navy could supply him, support him, and if it came to it, carry him away, and from which he could operate into the country around. The place was called Yorktown. It was a reasonable choice, as long as one assumption held. The whole position rested on British command of the water. While the fleet ruled the Chesapeake, Cornwallis was safe there, fed, reinforced, and always able to leave by sea. But if that command of the water were lost, even briefly, the army on that peninsula would have a river on one side, a bay on the other, and no road out at all. In choosing the ground, Cornwallis had put his army inside a trap that had not yet been built. And on the far side of a continent of forest and road, the Americans and the French were already gathering the pieces of it. The opening that appeared in the late summer of 1781 was the kind that comes once in a war, and Washington, who had been waiting years for exactly this, moved on it with a speed that astonished everyone, the enemy most of all. The key was something the French alliance had made possible for the first time, a combination of land power and sea power working to the same clock. A large French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was operating in American waters, and word reached Washington that it could come into the Chesapeake, though only for a limited time. Meanwhile, a French army under the Comte de Rochambeau had joined the American forces near New York. Washington saw the whole shape of it at once. If the French fleet could take control of the Chesapeake and cut Cornwallis off from the sea, and if the combined armies could march south fast enough to pin him against the water, then an entire British army might be caught with nowhere to go. Everything had to arrive together, across hundreds of miles of road and open ocean, with almost no margin anywhere. It is the sort of plan that reads beautifully and usually fails. This one did not fail. Washington and Rochambeau marched their combined armies south from the New York area with remarkable speed and, more remarkably, with enough secrecy and misdirection that the British commander in New York remained convinced the blow was coming at him. Camps were laid out where no army intended to stay. Roads were prepared toward objectives nobody meant to attack. So he sat still, holding his strength in the city, and did not move to interfere or to reinforce Virginia until the moment for it had passed. The Allied columns went down the roads in the late summer heat, thousands of men in 2 languages, hurrying toward a trap that was still only an idea. The French fleet made the Chesapeake, and when a British fleet came to challenge it and to relieve Cornwallis, the 2 forces fought off the Virginia Capes in the long, slow manner of sailing fleets, and the French held the water. Unable to break through, the British ships turned away. With that, the door closed. No supply, no reinforcement, no evacuation. The army on the peninsula was cut off from the sea it had been relying on, and the trap that had not existed a month earlier was now built and shut. The Allied armies converged on Yorktown and settled down to besiege it, and what followed was a methodical, professional, entirely unromantic operation conducted according to the formal art of taking a fortified place. The lines of trenches were dug, parallel to the defences, then pushed closer, then closer again, each night's digging bringing the works nearer to the British walls. The heavy artillery came up, including the powerful French siege guns, and the bombardment began. Day and night, the Allied guns worked on Yorktown. Imagine that sound going on without pause, the shudder in the ground, the smell of burnt powder settling into everything, the way the men inside those lines learned to sleep through it and then stopped sleeping at all. The bombardment grew heavier as the trenches crept in. The defences came apart piece by piece. The trapped army suffered steadily under a fire it could not answer. Key British strongpoints were stormed in night assaults, taken with bayonets in the dark by American and French columns, one of them led by a young colonel named Alexander Hamilton, who had begged for the honour of it. Each capture tightened the ring and let the guns come closer still, until the British position was simply untenable. And there was nothing coming. No fleet to lift them off, no army marching to break the siege. Cornwallis was running out of men, of powder, of food, of choices. He made one desperate attempt at escape, trying to ferry his army across the river by night and break out into open country, and a sudden squall came up and scattered the boats and ended it. The men who had got across had to be brought back. Whatever else a storm is, it is not negotiable. With his works crumbling, his soldiers exhausted and dying, no relief in prospect and no road out, Cornwallis accepted what the situation was. To go on would only be to spend an army for nothing. In October of 1781, he asked for terms, and then he surrendered his entire force to the combined American and French armies. Thousands of British and German soldiers marched out between the long, silent lines of Allied troops to lay down their weapons in a field. Cornwallis himself did not come. He pleaded illness and sent a subordinate in his place, who tried to offer the sword to the French commander, since surrendering to Frenchmen was at least a familiar humiliation. And Rochambeau quietly indicated that the gentleman had the wrong general and directed him to Washington, who directed him in turn to the American officer who had been made to surrender at Charleston. It was done with perfect courtesy and left nothing unsaid. By tradition, the British musicians are said to have played a tune as the column marched out, an old air whose title spoke of a world turned upside down. Historians doubt the story, and there is no good contemporary record of it. It has survived anyway, because it fits so exactly. A world had been turned over that afternoon. Yorktown did not formally end the war. There would be more skirmishing, more waiting, and a long stretch of negotiation before any peace was signed. But everyone standing in that field understood that something had ended. The capture of a second entire British army, arriving on top of years of inconclusive struggle, and a war that had spread across the oceans, broke the will of the British government and the British public to continue. The cost had grown too high, the prospect of victory too faint, the whole American business too tangled with fighting France and Spain and the Dutch in half the world at once. When the news reached London, the Prime Minister is said to have taken it like a physical blow and cried out that it was all over. He was right. The British appetite for subduing America collapsed with that sentence. There would be no more great campaigns. The war that had begun at dawn on a village green in Massachusetts, among farmers who expected to be home for breakfast, had been decided on a tobacco peninsula in Virginia. The United States had made good on the battlefield the independence it had declared 5 years before. What remained was to secure it somewhere quieter, in rooms with polished tables, among men with excellent manners and conflicting instructions. The Americans who went to Paris were the newest and weakest party at a table crowded with old powers, each with its own appetites, and they had to move carefully, or find their interests traded away as small change in somebody else's bargain. They were an extraordinary group. Benjamin Franklin led them, aged now, world-famous, with a charm and a shrewdness about European politics that made him perhaps the finest diplomat of his century. With him came John Adams, blunt and principled and tireless, and John Jay, sharp-eyed and suspicious by temperament, which turned out to be exactly the temperament required. Their talents fitted together like tools in a case. Their difficulty was delicate. They were formally allied to France and expected to coordinate every step with their ally. But they came to suspect, with reason, that French interests and American interests were not the same thing, that France was delighted to see Britain humbled and rather less delighted at the prospect of a large, strong United States that might grow into a power instead of remaining a grateful client. So the Americans made a bold and slightly risky decision. They negotiated directly with the British, pressing their own case hard, and got somewhat ahead of their ally in doing it. The terms they came away with were remarkably good, better than the military situation alone would have justified. Part of that was skill. Part of it was Britain's own calculation, that with the war lost, it would be wiser to detach these people from France and begin laying the ground for trade and future goodwill. In the treaty signed at Paris in 1783, Britain recognized the independence of the United States completely and without reservation. That was the prize the whole war had been fought for, now written down and signed by the very power that had spent 8 years trying to prevent it. And the treaty gave more than recognition. It granted the new nation generous boundaries, running west all the way to the Mississippi, room enough to shape its entire future. It settled fishing rights off the Canadian coasts, which mattered enormously in New England. It addressed old debts and the treatment of loyalists, though those last provisions would be honoured poorly and grudgingly in the years that came. For the loyalists themselves, the peace brought no comfort. They had wagered on the losing side, and they paid. Many thousands, unable or unwilling to live in the new republic, left everything and went as refugees to Canada, to Britain, to other corners of the empire, and began their lives again in exile. For them, the revolution was no glorious birth of liberty. It was the loss of home and property and country. Every revolution makes losers as well as winners, and this nation was born partly through the dispossession of a substantial portion of its own people, whose offence, in most cases, was loyalty to the government they had been born under. Still, set the whole arc of it side by side, and the transformation is difficult to take in. 13 quarrelsome colonies strung along the edge of a continent, people who had thought of themselves as British and drunk British tea and read London newspapers weeks out of date, had risen against the greatest empire of the age, fought it for 8 years, and come away with independence, recognition, and a vast country to build in. It astonished Europe. It astonished a good many Americans. Great empires do not, as a rule, lose to their own provinces, and the sheer improbability of it would colour the new nation's sense of itself for generations. But independence raised a question quite as hard as the war had been. The 13 states had united against a common enemy, while remaining 13 jealous sovereignties, loosely bound, deeply suspicious of central power after spending a decade fighting exactly that. Having thrown off a distant king, they were in no rush to build any strong government of their own, and the arrangement holding them together had been made weak on purpose. With the enemy gone, the weakness showed. The central government could not pay its debts or raise revenue, could not regulate trade or compel the states to cooperate, could not command respect abroad. The states bickered over boundaries and money. Hard times bred unrest, and when debt-ridden farmers in Massachusetts rose in arms, men of property everywhere were frightened by how plainly the government could not keep order. To many who had led the revolution, it began to look as though the thing they had won might simply come apart, undone not by any foreign power, but by its own frailty. Out of that anxiety came one of the most consequential meetings in human history. In the summer of 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia, in the same city where independence had been declared 11 years earlier, supposedly to repair the old arrangement. Behind closed doors, and in considerable secrecy, they did something far more ambitious. They wrote a new frame of government altogether, the Constitution, creating a federal authority with power to tax, to regulate commerce, to raise armies, to speak for the whole abroad, and to act directly upon citizens rather than merely upon states. And they divided that authority into branches, built to restrain one another, a legislature, an executive, a judiciary, each holding the others in check, an ingenious machine meant to be strong enough to govern, and structured so that no part of it could slide into the tyranny they had just fought to escape. It was an act of compromise as much as of vision, and some compromises were dark. The deepest concerned slavery, which the framers, unable or unwilling to end, instead accommodated and protected, postponing a reckoning that would arrive eventually at the cost of a far bloodier war than the Revolution had been. That old contradiction we noticed at the very start, present in the tobacco fields and in the edited draft of the Declaration, was carried forward into the Constitution, unresolved. A wound left in the middle of the new republic to fester for generations. The Revolution proclaimed a magnificent ideal and fell a long way short of it. And that gap has driven much of the country's history ever since. Because when Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, he and his colleagues were picturing a fairly narrow circle, free men of property much like themselves. But the words were universal, and universal words slip out of their author's hands. The enslaved, the poor, women, the excluded of every kind, would take hold of those words and turn them into a demand, holding the nation to the whole meaning of its own promise. The story since can be read as one long, halting, unfinished effort to make the country resemble the sentence it was founded on, and the tremor travelled outward. The example of a people setting aside a monarchy and building a republic on the consent of the governed unsettled the established order everywhere. Within a few years, France would have its own revolution, bloodier and wilder, drawing on the American example. The ideas let loose here, liberty, equality, government by consent, the right of a people to choose their own fate, would move across the world for centuries, feeding revolutions and reforms and the slow, uneven spread of self-government from one country to the next. It began as a local quarrel about a few pennies of tax. It became a demonstration that the old order of kings and subjects was not permanent, that people could govern themselves, that a nation could be founded on an idea. So our long journey closes where all long journeys close, in quiet. From a tense spring night on a Massachusetts green to a room of men writing in Philadelphia, by way of tea in a dark harbour, a declaration read aloud in the summer heat, boats among the ice, a winter of fire cake and bare feet, Saratoga, Yorktown. The people who lived through all of it were ordinary, frightened, uncertain, often bitterly divided, and almost never sure of what they were building. They did not know they were making history. They were only trying to get through a crisis that had arrived on their doorstep. And in the trying, they made something that outlasted every one of them. The night has grown deep now, and there is nothing further you need to carry. Let the names and the dates settle gently behind you. The green at Lexington in the grey light, the oars in the black water, the smoke of a winter camp, the long, silent lines standing in a Virginia field. Let all of it drift softly out of focus, like a landscape seen from a slowing train, growing smaller and softer until it is only a warmth somewhere behind your eyes. There is another journey waiting whenever you want it, and if this one kept you company, you are welcome to leave a thought below or gently tap like and subscribe. But not now. Now there is nothing to do at all. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders go heavy, and your hands, and the whole long weight of the day. Let the room be dark and warm around you. Close your eyes and rest. Good night.